Snyder.
Chapter 21. Announcement. Alex Vassal, Eden Island, 2018. I had taken my wife aside to try and calm her down after she received news of the spreading disaster in the outside world. Her first thought was to try and get in contact with everyone she had ever known and loved. Her first reaction was shock and disbelief, fear and sorrow. Like a roadmap of intersecting pathways, her emotions and thoughts convoluted and collided with one another, leaving only remnants of the intelligent, sharp-minded woman I had wed. My words to her were both soothing and true, a rare occurrence for me. She listened with splintered attention, staring through space as the magnitude of the situation slowly dawned on her. I reassured her that we were not only safe where we were, but we were going to stay that way. Our son was going to grow up, and we were going to grow old. I told her that we would message our friends who were sailing my annual charity event and redirect them to the island, and I told her, above all else, absolutely nothing about my involvement in or foreknowledge of the disaster. Eventually, she regained her composure. Then, after our conversation had concluded, we walked to our son Desmond's room, where he waited for us under the supervision of his nanny. "Thank you, Clara," I stated, addressing the nanny as she stepped towards the exit of Desmond's room. She seemed worried and afraid. I couldn't help but wonder what she'd seen and what she knew. "I'm going to be making a very important announcement soon. Report back to your quarters and make sure you keep your radio on. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Vassal," she replied, quickly exiting the room. No doubt my staff had become alarmed by the increased security and instructions to disregard their duties and listen to my upcoming address. But the significance of what I intended to say to them had little to do with their state of mind and everything to do with rebuilding the future. Frankly, I couldn't care less whether or not they felt safe or important. I couldn't care less whether or not they had lost their families and the lives they'd had together. Their only true significance in the new world I would make was to serve me as I endeavored to rebuild it. Of course, they would never understand that, and so I intended to coddle their egos and emotions like naive children, as had been the timeless custom of great leaders before me. I would have my people believe in themselves rather than live in reality. As my wife took a seat beside our son, I realized I needed to stop reciting my upcoming speech and focus on the moment. My wife, at this time in our son's life, was better able to connect with and understand Desmond. We had decided that she would break the news to him. I would be present as a figure of authority to soothe his confusion and reassure him that everything would be okay, but unlike my wife, I refused to treat him like a child. Confessions she had made in previous arguments revealed that she interpreted my callous behavior to be a distancing mechanism used to keep myself from experiencing the joys of fatherhood and from becoming vulnerable to my son's affections. And while I agreed with her assessment, I also refused to change. My responsibility as a father was not simply to love my son. It was to love him only as much as would make him a man. And in the climate of destruction and decay that I had set in motion, it was more important for me to be unyielding than compassionate. "Did I do something wrong?" Desmond asked, no doubt troubled by the fact that our movie night together had come to an abrupt and unexplained end. "No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong," Hannah replied, placing her arm around him and cupping his shoulder. "But something happened today that was very, very bad, and your father and I need to discuss what to do about it." "What happened?" "We don't know, really, but All over the world, people are fighting with each other and behaving very strangely, my wife explained, being so vague that her explanation would no doubt leave more questions than answers in Desmond's mind. I waited across from them, seated beside one another on the bed, and tightly pressed my hands together, fighting against a sudden compulsion to intervene. We're safe here, and you don't have to worry about anything. But we can't go home until we know everything's okay. Do you understand? I guess, he muttered, clearly at odds with what my wife had told him. He didn't understand. And from what she'd said and how she'd coddled him, how could he? Suddenly, I realized that it was not in his, hers, or my best interest to regard the situation as anything but what it truly was. I had to tell them the truth. Not about myself, of course, but about the threat we faced. It's a disease, I stated coldly, interrupting the calm and angelic poise that Hannah had tried to deliver the news to our son with. She turned to look at me, surprised and confused by my words. I had lied to her and said I didn't know what was happening. It causes people to become sick, die, and then attack, kill, and infect other people. There is no cure, there is no treatment, and worst of all, those that are infected with the disease, while technically deceased, remain animated and dangerous for as long as their bodies are able to sustain them. If we leave the island, we will risk infection. If anyone who has been exposed to the disease attempts to approach the island, we will also risk infection, I explained, watching the confused expressions of my family morph to fear and disbelief. This place is our home now, and likely we will not be able to leave it for some time. Your mother's right. You don't have anything to worry about, and we are safe here. But what's happening right now is far worse than people realize and will persist far longer than they are willing to accept. I finished, a baffled silence following my words. My wife stared at me, unable to fathom how I knew everything that I just said. I allowed my stern expression to subside as I pretended to feel remorse, bowing and shaking my head to give her the illusion of guilt. How do you know that? Hannah calmly asked, her tone bordering on accusation. Her eyes were intense and unyielding, demanding answers for not only why I hadn't told her earlier, but also why I decided to tell her now in front of our son. I paused a moment for dramatic effect and took a deep breath. I've seen it before, Hannah. It was one of Nathan's projects at Eden Corporation. I lied, placing the blame for my creation on the shoulders of my former best friend and confidant. I tried to shut it down, but I couldn't. I'm sorry I lied to you, but I just refused to believe this was happening, and I didn't have the courage to admit it. Hannah swallowed the tears building in her eyes, and I could see that my confession had evoked an even more devastating emotional response in her. She looked at me with a broken heart and heavy shoulders, but she never took her arm away from our son or allowed him to see how my words had pained her. Desmond seemed to accept my explanation for better or worse, comforted only by the fact that we sat at his side and had reassured him of our safety. He was too young to know the world well enough to miss it, and instead appeared concerned only for us. Hannah returned her attention to him and gently rubbed his shoulder. Your dad has to go talk to other people on the island, but he'll be back before you go to bed, okay? Hannah said, deciding for me that it was time to leave. Is it safe? Desmond protested, worried by and not fully understanding the explanation I had given him. I'll be fine, Desmond. Stay with your mother, and I'll see you soon, I replied, hesitating a moment before I left, unsure of exactly why Hannah had suddenly turned so cold. I had said the disease was Nathan's project, not mine. I'd even claimed to have tried to stop him, but as Hannah's hurt and angry eyes looked up from our son and glared at me, I decided it was best to address the matter after I had notified my staff of the outbreak. I stood up, nodded goodbye to Desmond, and exited the room. The personalized radio devices that I had outfitted my staff with served many purposes. First and foremost, they provided a quick and easy means of communicating between those on the island. Second, they allowed me to track the whereabouts of everyone within 1,000 feet of the shoreline. And third, they allowed me to listen in on what everyone else was saying. As I walked to the section of my mansion where I intended to make my announcement, I casually flipped through the chatter of my employees. Some had seen news footage of enormous riots. Others had been trying unsuccessfully to reach family for hours. Some had even gone online while the internet still worked and searched through panicked emergency forums looking for answers. But what was clear from everyone's confusions was the depth of their ignorance, shock, and brooding sense of panic. I adjusted the microphone on my desk and pulled my chair forward, finally able to make the announcement I had waited so long to give. "This is Alex Vossel," I began, sure to keep my tone somber yet firm. "I'm making this announcement to inform you of why you've been pulled away from your work and why you were told to report to your quarters," I continued, trying to think of what they'd want to hear, of what they'd want me to say. By now you've no doubt seen footage on the news of what's happening and how shocking and unimaginable today has been. We're all struggling to understand exactly what's happened and why people are behaving like this. I'm sorry to say I don't have the answers yet. I'm sorry to say that my attempts to communicate with the outside world have gone unanswered, and I'm sorry to say that we've found ourselves stranded on this island without a clue whether or not our friends and family are safe. It's eating me alive thinking about it, and I'm sure you're feeling the same, but I wanted to take the time to let you know that anything I can offer that will help you contact your loved ones is yours at a moment's notice. I've instructed my security personnel to give you whatever phone privileges you want, and I've already begun emitting an emergency signal in case there are others out there less fortunate than us that we might be able to assist. For the moment, we're safe here, and I will do everything in my power to protect the well-being of everyone on this island. But until we know more, it's important that we try to stay strong for one another. It's important that we don't let our concerns get the better of us and lose our sanity to despair. For all we know, things could be back to normal any moment, and we'll all be able to go home again. But until we know, this island will have to be our home, and we will have to try and make the best of it," I finished, turning off the microphone and losing my fabricated tone of empathy. And yet, despite my self-assured indifference, I could not help but linger under the weight of the announcement I'd made. I sat quietly for a moment, looking out my office window at the streetlights surrounding the paved pathways that connected each building and home. My own tiny city built for just this occasion. It was beautiful. It was paradise. In that moment, I felt a rush of emotion and visceral gratitude for everything I had done. I felt my tense and hardened disposition give way to relief finally accepting that those who could discover my plot were dead, and those who could stand in my way were gone. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, holding on to that moment for as long as my mind could keep from wandering. But I soon drifted to other worries and potential dilemmas. That I had spontaneously decided to inform my wife of the disease suddenly returned to my mind, and I experienced a strange moment of confusion, not fully understanding my own behavior. Perhaps I had told her because I couldn't stand seeing Desmond misled. Maybe it was because I believed she'd be thankful to know the truth about what had happened and would look to me admirably for answers and advice, or, most likely, and hardest for me to accept, I had told her because I simply couldn't hold it in any longer. Strange. A lifetime of lies and secrecy, and on the first day of my new world order, I deviated from my long-standing plan. I succumbed to a foolish need to genuinely connect with my family, and in doing so, embarrassed myself and endangered my lie. What if she told other people on the island that I knew in advance? What if Desmond mentioned it to someone? Semantics and rationalizing mean nothing to the fists of an angry mob, and even family could turn its back in desperate times. Suddenly, I was more tense and concerned than ever. For despite the fact that my rivals were dead and the slate had been wiped clean, I remained the same. The closed door to my office slowly opened, and Hannah stepped inside. Her cheeks were stained with fallen tears, and her expression was bare and broken. I stood up from my seat, just as fragile and unwound as she was, and approached her, hoping that she had come to reconcile our bitter exchange in Desmond's room. However, as I came to stand before her, intending to kiss her and hold her tight, her hand shot up from her side and slapped me hard across the face. I stood stunned, dismayed and confused. She shook her head, hurt, not angry. "You've seen it before," she said, reciting my words from earlier in the evening. I recalled my stern, unwavering admission of knowing about the disease before it had spread, just then realizing that Hannah had placed her anger and despair from the day's events on my shoulders. I stared at her, quietly hating her for blaming me, not because she was wrong to do so, but because she wasn't supposed to. "How could you? How could you?" she demanded, shoving me in the chest. I took a step back and tried to think of what to say, but as I looked into her eyes full of betrayal and sadness, I didn't want to lie to her anymore. All I wanted was to hold my wife and allow myself to share a moment of honesty. But as always, the lie came first. "You don't know the weight I've carried," I exclaimed, unable to keep myself completely buried. "You don't understand the choices I've had to make." "No, I don't, and I don't care. Look at what's happened, Alex. Just look at it," she cried, as my eyes turned to the open door, double-checking for anyone who might overhear us. "How could you?" she yelled, her words cutting me in a way I had assumed impossible. "I did everything I could," I screamed, referring to the misinformation I had given earlier about Nathan supposedly designing the disease. "I tried to stop him." "Then why didn't you?" she demanded, shoving me again. I grabbed hold of her and tried to keep her from fighting any more, but she was too devastated. Tears streamed down her face as I clung tightly to her shaking wrists. "Why didn't you stop him?" she asked again, breaking free of my grip. I pulled Hannah close to me and held on to her as she cried. Her hands continued to bang against my back with decreasing force until eventually we held each other. We stood together, my head pressed against hers as she wept on my shoulder, sharing a moment of honesty.